Hi, everyone. I would like to welcome Manon Schweinfurth today for her seminar. She has studied biology at the University of Mainz in Germany. Then she moved on for a PhD in Bern, Switzerland, and currently she is at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where she's heading the group of called Origins of Mind Research Group. And she has done a lot of work on studying reciprocity, altruism across a variety of animals, non-human primates, humans, and rodents. We are very happy to have you today, Manon, and looking forward for your talk. For the questions, please put it in the comment chat or in the ask a question function of the webinar. The floor is yours, Manon.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you very much for having me. It's a great honor to be talking to you, and thanks everybody for joining. I will try to share my screen. See whether that is working. Okay. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining. Today I'm going to talk about evolutionary and psychological origins of reciprocal cooperation. Very broadly speaking, I'm interested in the evolution of cooperative behaviors. And cooperation happens very regularly, not only in humans, but also in all kinds of other animals. So we see, for instance, cooperatively breeding fish, like here on the left side, where the fish are taking care of the eggs of someone else. But also birds help each other and cooperate with each other by, for instance, mobbing away predators. Chimpanzees cooperate, for instance, by collaboratively hunting together. And the prime example of cooperation are, of course, eusocial insects, where some individuals forgo their own reproduction in order to help others raising their offspring. If we try to summarize this variety of behavior, we can say one individual helps another one, or one individual benefits another one. If we try to understand the evolution of such behaviors, we make an important distinction. Some of those behaviors are immediately beneficial for all involved parties. So in the case of the chimpanzee, for instance, it makes sense for them to hunt as a group, but because only as a group they're able to bring down large prey. And so the evolution of such behaviors is relatively straightforward, because if you join in a hunt, then you will also get a part of the prey. So you should always perform an action that is beneficial to yourself. However, there are also a couple of other behaviors that are immediately beneficial only for recipients, and those are more difficult to explain. So why should, for instance, this fish care for the eggs of someone else? And already Darwin recognized that this is a major threat to his whole theory of natural selection, because he predicted that selection should favor those that outcompete others and not those that help others and provide benefits to them. A couple of years later, there was a solution proposed to this dilemma, which is called the kin selection theory. So here we might observe that one individual helps another one, and because of that help, the partner B reproduces more often or better. And so this is in the interest of the helper, because the helper shares some genes with the recipient, and by helping someone who is related, they indirectly transmit genes to the next generation. Obviously, this theory can only apply to individuals that are related to one another. However, we know that cooperation takes place frequently also between non-kin. Think about our business relationship. Think about our friendships, for instance. And so probably the most extreme examples where individuals are unrelated and help each other is in situations where individuals from different species come together, like this cleaner wrest cleaning the surface of a big lionfish. So how does that work? A couple of years later, Robert Trivers proposed a solution to this dilemma, which is called the reciprocity theory. So here we might observe that one individual helps another one, and then later on this partner reciprocates the favor or returns the favor. So importantly, while both individuals are paying some costs while they are helping others, they are also receiving benefits because they are helped. And on top, they are better off than other individuals who don't help anyone but also never receive any help when they're in need. Reciprocity is omnipresent in humans. We reciprocate on a daily basis. It might not always be obvious for us because we're using money in between, but reciprocity happens on a daily basis. It happens between individuals, but it also happens when individuals set up trading rules, even across nations. Reciprocity also emerges relatively early in our ontogeny, suggesting that it's really important for us. Sometimes, which I find super funny, is economics refer to us as homo reciprocans in order to illustrate how important reciprocity is in our cooperative decisions. So what about other animals? Well, we saw a rise of reciprocity also in the animal behavior literature. It was considered to be a key concept in behavioral ecology, and we saw a vast majority or many different studies suggesting there is evidence for reciprocity, like, for instance, vampire bats sharing blood with each other, sticklebacks taking turns when they are inspecting predators, and various animals showing allogrooming according to reciprocal decision rules. However, today I would say we face a very different situation. We face a fall of reciprocity. Some people are asking questions like, why is reciprocity so rare in social animals, and thereby assume that reciprocity is very present in humans, but very rare, if at all, present in non-human animals. Others are making predictions about reciprocity, or I should say, others are saying that cooperation between non-kin is so rare that we don't really need to have mechanisms explaining them, because most cooperation happens between kin. And finally, there's a whole bunch of literature trying to explain why reciprocity is so rare in social animals. When I went deeper into this literature, I tried to understand why is there so much criticism and skepticism around reciprocal cooperation. And I identified at least 3 key concepts why people are so skeptical about reciprocity. First of all, reciprocity is believed to be so cognitively challenging that most likely only humans are capable of reciprocating favors. Second, some people believe that kinship is much more important than reciprocity, and therefore we don't even need reciprocity as a mechanism to explain cooperation. And finally, there is a perceived lack of evidence. So Trivers proposed this theory in the 70s, and so you will find many studies starting with a sentence saying things like, despite many years of research, reciprocity has not been found, or things like that. So the aim of this talk is first to talk a little bit about how cognitively challenging is reciprocity, whether kinship is indeed more important than reciprocity, and to understand whether there is a perceived lack of evidence and what we can do about it. This part will be mainly based on my research on rats, and then I will move on to the second part of this talk, where I will turn a bit more to the human side and ask about what is the evolutionary origins of our human reciprocity. And then I will talk a little bit about the psychological origins of reciprocity and why I think that it's important to study them. Let's start with the first part and the rodent aspect. So Norway rats, which is the typical rat that you will find outside and that are also the lab rats, are super social. They live in large social colonies, like in large groups of up to 200 individuals, and they establish these underground burrow systems. Importantly for all of my studies is that they are highly tolerant around food and are happy to share food with each other. Food that is of low quality, like fruit or veg, but also of high quality, like meat or eggs, for instance. We can bring those rats to the lab and study how they're sharing the food with each other by using this experimental device. If you wonder why the video is in red, so we're working under red light conditions because rats are nocturnal animals and don't see the color red. And so during our night, we switch on the bright light, and then it's bright for them and they can sleep during our day, so to say. So this is the experimental setup, which is an experimental cage that is divided into 2 chambers with 1 rat on each side. In front of this experimental cage, there is a movable platform that is connected to a stick. On the other side of the platform, there is a food reward. In this case, it's a little oat flake. And what you will see is that by pulling the stick, the whole platform moves into the experimental cage and provides food only to the recipient. Later on, we can then reverse the roles and ask the previous recipient, hey, would you like to reciprocate? Would you like to pay back the received favors? And as you see, the rats are happy to do so. So let's talk a little bit about how cognitively challenging reciprocity is. And for this, I brought an example. Imagine you are the rat in the middle and you meet another rat. And this rat is cooperative. All you need to remember is cooperation, and that's it. It gets more complicated if you meet a second partner. Now you need to individually recognize individual A as A and B as B, and you need to tag A as being cooperative and B as being uncooperative. Obviously, this gets more and more complicated the more individuals you meet. So there's a lot of information that you need to store. And to make things slightly worse, humans, like I'm sure you as well, rarely meet partners who are only cooperative or only uncooperative. So they might provide different cooperation experiences. And then you need to memorize the encounters of multiple encounters, which means like individual A was maybe cooperative on day 1, uncooperative on day 2, again cooperative on day 3, and so on. So you see there are many details that you need to memorize in order to reciprocate, which is why people think that reciprocity is too cognitively challenging to be shown by other animals than humans. So therefore, in this project, I asked, do rats integrate several experiences with each other, or do they find, or have they evolved a mechanism that is cognitively simpler in order to store fewer memory details? This is the experimental setup that made use of exactly the same food sharing paradigm that you have seen in the little video clip. So here, my focal rats experience one partner over multiple days. On day 1, the partner was cooperatively sharing food, as on day 2 and 3. On day 4, however, the platform was blocked and the partner could not provide any food. So 24 hours later, I reversed the roles and asked the focal rat, okay, now it's your turn. How much food would you like to donate to a partner who was overall cooperative and just failed to cooperate on the last day? And I compared this to a second partner that was uncooperative on day 1, 2, and 3, and cooperated on the last day. And I compared this to partners that were only experienced once as a cooperator and once as a defector. And so I predicted that if rats use a simpler cognitive strategy by only considering the last encounter with a partner, they should provide food more often to partners that were overall uncooperative but cooperated on the last day, and that there should be no difference between a partner that was only experienced once as a cooperator. If rats, however, take several encounters into account, then they should provide food more often to those partners that also cooperated more often. And these are the results. First of all, first I show the data for partners that were experienced only once as a cooperator and once as a defector, and not very surprisingly, the rats donated more food to cooperators than to defectors. This is the data for partners being experienced several times, and that was really interesting to us because here the rats cooperated more often with partners that were overall uncooperative and only cooperated in the last day, and helped them more than partners that were overall cooperative and only defected on the last day. So that suggests that rats mostly take into account the last experience with a partner. So memory demands can be lowered by only considering the last move of a partner, and rats are able to reciprocate with each other. So cognitive demands can be lowered, and reciprocity is not necessarily cognitively demanding. What about kinship? So there is this general assumption that reciprocity is only important among non-kin. And as soon as individuals are related to one another, that's basically the end of the story. We know it. It's all about kin selection. However, we just don't know this. And the reason why we don't know it is that studies on reciprocity usually avoid kin, which I have done in my studies as well, because kinship could be a confounding factor. And the same also applies to studies that are investigating kin selection. So they usually avoid the possibility of reciprocity because it could be confounding their results. So what I did here was asking, are nepotism and reciprocity mutually exclusive mechanisms, or can they happen at the same time? How did I study this? So right after weaning, I separated my rats into different groups, and so they had siblings in different groups but had no direct interactions with their siblings for 16 months before I did my experiment. And 16 months is a really long time frame for rats, actually. So during the experiment, my focal rats experienced an unrelated cooperative and uncooperative partner before they could reciprocate the favor, just in the previous experiment. But they also experienced a related but unfamiliar cooperative and uncooperative partner. And so I had a couple of different predictions for this experiment. So if you would predict that reciprocity and nepotism is really exclusive, you could predict a pattern like this. So indicated in the dashed line is the behavior for related partners who should always receive a lot of help independently of whether they helped in the past or not. And if reciprocity only happens between unrelated individuals, then you should predict that cooperative partners receive more help than uncooperative partners. You could also predict that reciprocity overrides kin or nepotism in this situation, and there is no difference between related and unrelated partners. You could also predict that reciprocity is important for both for related and unrelated partners, but related partners receive on top more help than unrelated partners. And these are the results. So what we see again beautifully is that rats reciprocate. They reciprocate help with related and unrelated partners. Interestingly for us was that the unrelated partners received more help than the related partners. Overall, however, I think what this study shows is that kin and non-kin reciprocate food donations, which is an important finding. Why did related rats donate less food to each other, which was really astonishing to us? And we thought that potentially they invest more in relationships with non-kin. And we see that under some circumstances in humans as well, so that we invest more into friendships because when we really need help, probably relatives will help us anyways, but we need friends in order to broaden our network. And the same was found in vampire bats. Vampire bats are better off when they have a big network that extends from the family to also unrelated individuals. But that was nothing that we predicted, and we need to look into that a little bit more. Overall, however, I think the take-home message from this project is reciprocity takes place between kin and non-kin. And just because individuals are related to one another, that should not be the end of the story. And we vastly underestimate reciprocity if we only consider non-kin interactions. What about now the perceived lack of evidence? First of all, I would like to highlight that there is evidence for reciprocity. Vampire bats have been shown repeatedly to reciprocate food, both in captivity and also in the wild. Birds reciprocate. For instance, ravens help each other during flight and reciprocate this support. Fish reciprocate. These fish, for instance, feed and diet, and while one is feeding, the other is vigilantly scanning the environment, and then they take turns. Worms reciprocate, and that's a beautiful example. So this is a hermaphrodite worm, and they trade eggs and sperms with each other according to reciprocity. And, which I find super cool, is also bacteria have been shown to use reciprocity when they are trading certain molecules with each other. So what's the problem with this evidence now? Well, people acknowledge that there is evidence, but they don't find it particularly convincing. So the problem with some of those studies is that they are using artificial testing setups, like the studies that I am using with my rats. And so because rats are unlikely to help each other by pulling little platforms into the reach of each other in the wild, people have questioned how ecologically valid those studies are. If researchers then go out to the field and study the naturally occurring behavior of animals, they very often can only establish a correlational evidence between received and given help. But as we all know, correlations might not be causations. To make things slightly worse, is very often what we find in the literature is mixed evidence. So while some people find reciprocity in a given species, others don't. And I think that this is mainly due to a standard assumption in the literature, which means basically reciprocity means paying like with like allogrooming for allogrooming or support for support. But what if, especially with a low sample size, individuals are trading allogrooming for support, but we only focus on allogrooming? Then we might miss a reciprocal pattern. However, I'm not the first one who suggested that individuals are capable of trading different commodities with each other, but they said, okay, wait a minute. This is so cognitively demanding that no animal other than humans can really do it, because you need to have a concept of value. Or in other words, how often do you need to groom someone who has potentially saved your life because he pointed out that a predator is right behind you? So in this project, I wanted to kill 3 birds with 1 stone, essentially. First, I wanted to develop a tool set to manipulate naturally occurring behavior to bridge the gap between causal experimental studies that are, however, artificial, and naturally occurring behaviors that so far has only resulted in correlational evidence. And I wanted to validate the most common artificial testing setup, which is the bar pulling paradigm, in order to understand whether results obtained on those studies, on those setups, can translate into meaningful behaviors, and therefore we shouldn't reject those findings. And I wanted to know whether rats are able to trade different commodities with each other, which would speak in favor that other animals might be capable of doing that as well. So I knew that rats are very good at trading food with each other, so I needed to look at or find another commodity. And when you have worked with rats, you know that the most common prosocial behavior that they are showing is allogrooming. And they preferably groom each other at spots that are difficult to reach, like the neck region. And so in this study, I basically tried to manipulate the grooming behavior by having, again, like in the food sharing experiments, an experience and a test phase. The experience phase was divided into 2 parts. In the first part, the focal rat and his partner were separated from each other. And in the second part, they could freely interact. And in order to induce grooming behavior, I applied salt water on the focal rat's neck. And I used salt water in a concentration that the rats really hate, because I wasn't sure if I would smear honey, for instance, on the rats, whether they would appreciate that someone groomed them and treat this as favor, because they might want to groom and lick it off all by themselves. And so in the test phase, I then applied salt water on the partner's neck and noted down how often they were groomed by a focal partner. And I compared this to a situation where I used the same diet by applied salt water on the focal rat's neck during the closed phase. So accordingly, I had lower grooming levels in the open phase there compared to when I applied salt water on the focal rat's neck. These are the results. So again, what we find is reciprocity. Partners, focal rats groom partners more often when they groomed them before compared to the very same partner that groomed them as well. And I tested this with subdominant and dominant individuals, and I find basically the same pattern for dominance and subordinates. So again, there is reciprocity, and rats groom each other reciprocally, which was a very important finding to me, because I thought, okay, this is a nice finding, because I could show not only do rats share food with each other, but they also do it in a naturally occurring behavior. So no training was involved whatsoever. And I thought it's a very beautiful example, because you can easily apply those, this setup or this protocol also to other species. Many species groom each other, from invertebrates up to primates. And so this is a nice protocol to use in order to study experimentally naturally occurring behaviors. So I could tick this box, and now I had 2 commodities, food sharing and allogrooming, which enabled me to look at the next 2 points. So in this study, I basically intermixed those 2 commodities. My focal rats, indicated in green here, experience one and the same partner in 4 different conditions. Once the partner was a cooperative groomer, or an uncooperative groomer, a cooperative food provider, or an uncooperative food provider. And then after experiencing their partner, they could reciprocate using the other commodity. These are the results. So now you see every line represents the behavior of a focal rat towards one and the same partner that in one situation provided food or not. And as most of the lines go down, you see that they do reciprocate grooming for food sharing. And we also find this in the reverse situation. So that was super cool, because here I could show that although being artificial, the food donation paradigm can translate into biologically relevant behaviors. And so we should not reject findings on those studies prematurely because they can be meaningful. And I could also show that rats are capable of trading different commodities. And so when we go out to the field and study whether reciprocity is shown in other species, we need to ensure that we incorporate all different commodities in our studies in order to not miss reciprocity. So as a take-home message, reciprocity might be widely underestimated if we don't consider commodity trading. So that leads me to my second part. So whenever I went to conferences or spoke to colleagues about my rodent work, they said, yeah, okay, your rats might be very good in reciprocating, but that's so different to how we humans reciprocate. So it must have evolved independently. And so I thought, well, okay, well, then I have a look at the evolutionary origins of human reciprocity. And the prime, or basically what I wanted to know is our reciprocity, has this evolved before our lineage? Do we share this with other animals? And so a good candidate for looking into this is our closest living relatives, which are other primates. But here comes the problem. So whenever I talk to colleagues working on non-human primates, they say, well, don't even try. There is no good evidence for reciprocity in non-human primates. So that suggests that reciprocity evolved independently from other animals and humans. So I sat down and asked, well, is there really no good evidence for reciprocity in non-human primates? And I looked at the published literature. I identified roughly 30 experimental studies on 11 species investigating reciprocity in experimental studies. And I found roughly 200 species, roughly 200 observational studies on non-human primates. And so when we just ask the simple question, how many of those studies provide evidence for reciprocity, we'll look at the observational studies first, we see that the vast majority of those studies show evidence for reciprocity. Now you could say, well, okay, maybe this pattern is only driven by a publication bias. So people are more likely to publish positive findings. And so I was looking into whether I could do a meta-analysis and correct for publication bias. However, I would have to reduce the data set so much that it almost became useless. So, however, there are a couple of meta-analyses of subsets of this big data sets, and all of them control for publication biases, and all of them still found evidence for reciprocity when they looked at certain commodities like allogrooming or only support for allogrooming, etc. So this pattern is unlikely to be driven just by a publication bias. But the problem remains with observational studies that it's basically a correlation between received and given help, and that this correlation could be driven by reciprocity, but also by other confounding factors like proximity, kinship, friendships, or whatever. So what we really need is have a look at the experimental studies. How does the pattern look here? Well, it doesn't look that different other than the sample size is much lower. So the majority, again, provides evidence for reciprocity. What do we conclude from those studies? Well, first of all, those studies show that there is evidence for reciprocity in our closest living relatives. So maybe our reciprocity is indeed shared with other animals. So, and I'm really surprised that this evidence has not been acknowledged in the literature enough. But I'm also interested in the studies that seem to find no evidence for reciprocity. I think that those studies are great because they enable us to explore the parameter space of the theory of reciprocity. What do I mean with that? I really think that reciprocity makes more sense under some circumstances than others. And because those studies differ in many aspects from each other, we can study them. These studies differ, for instance, in commodity characteristics, how we're looking at food sharing, allogrooming, support, or whatever. What about kinship? Sometimes these studies look entirely at related individuals. Some of them only look at unrelated individuals. What about partner choice? So in some experiments, individuals could choose their cooperation partners, while in others they were tested in diets and had to control the behavior of their partner. Relationship qualities. So some of those studies looked at strangers, others at group members, others looked at close friends. And also the time frame differs a lot between these studies. Some of the studies look at very short-term reciprocity, like taking turns or reciprocity within a couple of minutes. Others look at much longer time scales, like months or years, etc. So due to time constraints, I can't talk about all those different aspects, and I will illustrate the point by looking at commodity characteristics. There is this common assumption that I also thought for a very long time, that as long as the value is the same, it shouldn't matter whether you are trading support, whether you are trading allogrooming or food or whatever, as long as the value is more or less the same. When we're looking at the experimental studies on non-human primates, we see in indicated in blue here, the vast majority of those studies look at food sharing behavior. And this is for obvious reasons. You know that your participants are motivated to take part. They will like what you are giving them. You can count food items, etc. So it's just very easy to work with food. However, when I thought more about food, I thought, well, food is actually a very peculiar commodity. It's the only commodity that you can own. You can't own support. You can't groom yourself as well as others might be doing, and you can't own your grooming. And this ownership comes with a couple of characteristics. So many primates show loss aversion, so they are averse of giving away something that they already possess. And in line with that is that many primates have a respect for ownership. So I not only work on rats, but I also work on chimpanzees. And here I brought a picture of Brian and Roxy. Brian is holding an enchima ball, which is something to eat. And Roxy here on the left side would really like to have that, she would like to eat something from it. However, Roxy would never dare to just grab the food out of Brian's hand, and Brian would be furious if she would do this. Instead, what she was doing shortly after that picture was taken was that she kindly begged that Brian gave something of the food to her, and then Brian dropped a little bit that Roxy was allowed to take. Overall, however, food sharing is not very common among non-human primates. Only 20 species show this outside the mother-infant situation, which is roughly 10% of the species. If food sharing happens, it's very often passive, like Brian dropping a little bit of the food, but never just reaching out and handing it over to Roxy. Let's have a look now at the likelihood to find reciprocity based on different commodities. And we're looking again first at the observational studies. So what you see here is, first of all, a very obvious pattern that the vast majorities of those studies look at non-food exchanges, just because food sharing doesn't happen very often in non-human primates. When we look at the food sharing behavior, what we see is a not particularly convincing pattern. So there is no good evidence actually for food sharing and reciprocity. How does it look like for the experimental studies? First of all, what we also show in the chart before, that the majority of those studies look at food sharing behaviors in those experimental studies. What I find particularly interesting is that today, all studies that looked at reciprocity in non-food exchanges like allogrooming or support found evidence for reciprocity. Although, I mean, of course, the sample size is super small and we need to investigate this further, but I think we should think about a more revised and a more comprehensive theory of reciprocity. We should really think about situations under which we predict reciprocity to occur and under which circumstances we don't think that reciprocity is of greater importance. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the psychological origins of reciprocity. So my work on rats suggests that they don't use very complex calculation. It's probably the last encounter that they are using with a partner. So how do they do it? How do humans and other animals then reciprocate favors, or how do they cooperate with each other? And I think if we understand a bit more about the different cognitive mechanisms that they are using for this, this might inform us about different evolutionary origins. For this, it's important to remember that reciprocity is an umbrella term. Reciprocity basically describes that received and given help is somehow related, it's somehow correlated, but we don't know how individuals make this correlation. And so there are different pathways. I identified at least 3 different decision rules how you can come up with reciprocity. And I also found at least 4 different proximate mechanisms that enable individuals to reciprocate. So, of course, I don't want you to remember this horrible table, but all I want to say is that there are different forms of reciprocity, and they are different for different species. And I think it's really interesting to look at those different cognitive mechanisms and potentially map them to the phylogeny. And then maybe this enables us to look at how often reciprocity has evolved and whether our form of reciprocity is indeed unique or whether we find the same forms of reciprocity also in other animals. So I strongly believe that the question should not be anymore, does reciprocity exist, but how does it work? I thought instead of just presenting to you all the neat stuff that has already been published or that's close to be published, I also want to show you, or I want to give you a little bit of an insight what my team and I were currently doing. So we are also working with chimpanzees in a sanctuary in Zambia, which is called Chimfunshi. And there the chimps are kept in large outdoor enclosures, and because they are very strong and I can't use these little platforms that my rat kindly pull for each other, we basically cemented the setup in the ground for them. And what you see is a food sharing apparatus here. So there are 2 buttons, like here is a button, and by pushing the button, juice is released over there, and there is another button, and by pushing the button, juice is released on the right side. So what you see now here are 2 juvenile chimpanzees, Jewel and Kenny. And now Kenny is pushing on the right side the button, which releases juice on the other side that enables Jewel to drink from this juice fountain. As soon as Kenny releases the button, the juice flow stops, and that creates a dilemma because they can never produce juice for themselves, but they need a partner. And so what you will see now is that Jewel reciprocates. So he waits until Kenny is over at the other fountain and then pushes the button so that Kenny drinks. And so what we also found is that most likely chimpanzees use various different strategies when they are cooperating with each other, and that's something we're currently exploring. But we are also working with chimpanzees in a zoo setting, which enables us to do very neat experiments about eye tracking, thermal images, etc. I've also started together with my team working on children, and we're trying to understand how children reciprocate and how they're cooperating with each other. And here we try to understand, especially in kids that are unable to count yet, what's the role of emotions when they're cooperating with each other. Because the pandemic has influenced the way how we're running our experiments, as probably so many of you as well, I've also started working with adult humans, trying to understand how they are reciprocating with each other, which is something that I'm currently super excited about, and which works very well also in a virtual environment. But of course, I'm also continuing working with rats, and we're currently establishing our own rat lab in St. Andrews, which is very exciting. And so you will hear more about the rats' work in the future. With this, I would like to thank you for listening. I would like to thank all the funders making this work happening, but also, and most importantly, I would like to thank everybody who was fundamental for all those studies. Without my fantastic collaborators, all of this would have not been possible. And I would like to thank scientific, like academic collaborators, but also non-academic, animal caretakers, animal trainers, and also all the students who helped in these projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manon. If somebody have any questions, can you please just post it in the chat while I'm asking my own questions to Manon. So first, generally, it seems that the evidence is compelling for reciprocity. So can you speculate why the reasons of resisting it? Is it because it's contradictory to sexual selection theory, like fundamentally in terms of evolutionary processes? Do you think that this is the reason?
I think there are different reasons, to be honest. So I think one of the reasons is that people confuse, so to say, like these very complex form of reciprocity, where you need to keep track of different commodities, the value, when did I get it, how much did I get, and so on. And then came up with a solution that, because it's so complex, we can't see it in other animals. But I think we somehow forgot that there are different ways, different cognitive mechanisms to come up with reciprocity. And so I think this is one of the reasons why people think that it's not very compelling. And the other reason why I think still people are skeptical about reciprocity are the different studies. Like, as I said, either it's causal, but then very often we're using artificial testing setups, or you go out to the field and study their naturally occurring behaviors, but then it's very often only observational evidence. And I think we need more studies that bridge this gap. And I hope that studies that use similar protocols, like smearing something on, I don't know, birds or ants or whatever, would give us some insights about this.
Okay. And the diversity of strategies, do you think it's just, again, to the question of evolution, do you think it's related to the ideas coming from the niche construction theory? Like where animals will like adopt certain social strategies in their own niche. So that's maybe also, it reminds me of this literature. The other thing is you studied, so did you look at the hierarchy? So within rats, you have like hierarchy established within the social structure. So how does this affect?
Yeah, so we had a look for the allogrooming behavior with a hierarchy would impact their use of reciprocity. And so we have different, so you can basically have different predictions about it. So you could groom up the hierarchy, you could groom down the hierarchy. Reciprocity might not be important for dominance because you want to appease them. What we found, again, our rats are just so much into reciprocity. What we find is that they are reciprocal towards subordinates, but also towards dominance. But dominance overall receive more help. So it's a little bit like, it's a similar picture like for the kin study. So reciprocity is important for both subordinates and dominance, but dominance just receive more help.
Okay, and do you think, again, back to the genetic and evolutionary question, do you think it's a heritable trait?
We don't know. We would like to look at this. So far, our rats have never reproduced, and so I can't tell you for our rats whether it's they have a personality trait, so to say, and that is then has a genetic basis that goes to the next generation. My hint would be probably that's something what we see. We have the feeling that rats that are very reciprocal, like make a huge distinction between cooperators and defectors, do that in other experiments as well. And so...
and this will be a strong evidence, like evolutionary-wise, that this is like a passed-on characteristic. So I think it will make it even sound more like it has to be there evolutionary. The other last question is that I got is, what about higher order? So what's your expectation if I just have a third, if I have a third animal? Because, you can say that these two animals are the building block of a bit of a little rodent society. So do you have expectations on like how would we go about a bit of a higher order?
Yeah, so we tried several things about this, and so I haven't worked extensively on this topic. So we were interested in whether if they encountered, for instance, a very cooperative individual, whether they would choose to interact with that individual afterwards. And so we wanted to give them little cat flaps where they can go in but not go out and so on, but it proved to be super difficult, and so we ended up not doing the experiment. So I can't tell you about this, but it was a super interesting study done from the Skeeter lab, where they were looking at partner choice and partner control in capuchins, which I think was super interesting. Another pattern that we saw in the groups of the rats was that they seem to not have preferred partners, like they seem to not have a best friend in their group, which was very interesting to us. So the rats are very sweet with each other, and they groom each other, they support each other, and it looks like that they have a preferred partner, but this partner is just not the same 2 days afterwards. And it's not the same if we observe them in their home cage or when we observe them in an open arena. And we tested this for so many colonies, and I thought, okay, that's weird. Why don't they have bonds? Why don't they have friendships, at least in our data? And so that's when I did the experiment that I presented here as the first experiment, where I gave them partners that differed in their cooperative tendency. And I think that that's really the key. That's the solution, I think, to the problem. I think what the rats are doing is they don't form preferential relationships, but they memorize the last encounter. And if that was positive with a partner, they will help the partner.
So you can say that the generalist interaction, and then they can form this specific memories.
Which is so weird, right? And it's so different to how we're doing it.
Yeah, it's different than ours, definitely. But it's interesting in its own because, you know, you're studying the general, like social interaction. So the other question I got here is the social cues. So is there chemotactic cues, and you know, they communicate also with ultrasound? Is there any way that they are, like, even if they are in two boxes, there is
there is a lot going on. So we did a fun experiment where the partner could not help, and so we looked at basically how do the rats respond. And so what they do is, first of all, when they're, when they want to get to the food but the partner is not responding, they try to reach in order to get it, although they can't get it. So if the partner then doesn't respond, they basically escalate to the next stage. So that's when they are communicating in the ultrasonic range. That's and they emit 50 kilohertz calls, which are very soft, short calls. If that doesn't work, they get mad. Then they jump to the dividing mesh, they rattle, and they are really noisy in order to get food. And we see that the whole cascade is basically move forward when they are hungry. So they start doing everything earlier. And yes, they do communicate.
That's good. The other question I got is, so I assume these are male.
I tested both males and females.
But did you mix like male with female?
I had this glorious idea once, but my males were just so excited about seeing females because I kept them in different rooms. And so that was the first time that they saw their females. So I think that they just had everything else in their mind except for cooperating. I think, however, it would be super interesting to keep them in mixed colonies. And then when the guys are a bit more habituated to the presence of females, I think it would be super interesting to see whether they are more cooperative towards females when they're in estrus or whatever. Generally, in the wild, males and females just don't interact that much with each other other than copulating. But I think it would be interesting to see.
So I got another question, could this last encounter within the rat be associated with indirect reciprocity, which allows them to respond without thinking about previous encounters?
It's always so difficult to know what my rats are thinking and how they're making their decisions. But it's for all our studies, it was not that they just received the experience and then they were in a good mood or whatever and then helped their partner, but we had at least 24 hours always in between the experience and the test phase. And what we also found for another experiment that I didn't show here today was we had an experience phase and then 8 days of a break. And so at least, it's not that they're just in a certain mood or there are any other kind of changes to them, but they really remember this individual specific cooperation for at least 8 days. We don't know, maybe for even longer.
Another question is, what about the age of the rats? So do you think it's developmentally regulated? Like, are they, more cooperative when they're younger or older? Did you test different ages?
That's a good question. So I work with the rats for at least, until the end, basically. My rats are allowed to get very old in our labs. Yeah. And so we have worked with them from directly after weaning, which is a couple of weeks, until they're even 3 years old. We don't see any differences according to age. However, having said this, maybe when they are super young, when they're still in this playful phase for the first 3 or 4 months, they might cooperate differently with their partners. We just don't know this because the training takes at least 3 months in order to participate in this. But I think for the grooming studies, we could look at this, but we haven't. But I think it's an excellent question.
But age-wise, then in non-human primates, I saw the chimpanzees have different ages. So do you think also non-human primates might have a different developmental trajectory when it comes to reciprocity because they have a longer lifespan, I think?
Yeah, it's so difficult to say, to be honest, because especially for the experimental stuff, the youngsters are just super responsive to all those experiments. They love the juice. They love to play with the stuff that we're presenting to them. And our males, like the older ones, they just have other things to do. So I think that they are less motivated to take part in our experiments. From the observational studies, I think we don't see many differences here other than it's different behaviors that they are showing in different life stages. So the youngsters play a lot and show reciprocity there. But when they are old, there are other behaviors that they are reciprocating: allogrooming, support, etc. So
cool.
I think it's difficult to compare.
Okay, I think we have no further questions. Thank you, Manon, for this great talk, and looking forward.
Thank you for having me.
More work. Take care.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really great, and thanks